this video, we will be talking about a missing woman that was involved in a case that to this day remains unsolved. Her name was Helen Brock, and she was the heiress to the candy empire, and I'm sure many of us here have heard of Brock's candy or have seen it before. I know I certainly have, and many years ago in 1977, she would go missing. You would think that there would be a lot of sweet things about being the heiress to a very successful candy empire, but unfortunately today's case and this story is nothing but sinister. Nothing sweet about this case. Before we fully dive into it, let's get our housekeeping out of the way. First, on the pinned comment, you will find a comment from me listing 3 cases that I am interested in covering. If you are not new to the channel, you know that I love to have your input as to the cases that we cover. And this case today is actually one of the cases that was the most voted for on a previous video, so please check that pinned comment out and vote with the one that sounds the most interesting. Second is the hidden gem. At some point in the video, I will give you a hidden gem comment, and that is like the main fact of the video. It could be about myself, it could be about the case, but when you hear that hidden gem come up, please comment it down below. Now, I'll just be honest, given that I took a break from filming, I am still working out the kinks on how the hidden gems will benefit you. I did kind of think about making something along the lines of a Patreon, and somebody did suggest that if I did that, then if you comment, hidden gems 5 times a month, then you would get the next month subscription cost free, something like that. The original plan was to just increase the number of videos a month I put out on YouTube, but I am still playing around with that, just in full transparency. But nonetheless, please make sure you comment the hidden gem in the comment section. And final housekeeping. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, I would greatly appreciate if you considered doing so. Okay, so let's talk about this candy heiress. So, the investigation into the disappearance of Helen Brock would happen in 1977. The investigators that were involved in this really had no idea what they were getting into when it came to this case. It would become a high-profile missing persons case that would grow into a complex plot involving top-flight show horses, con artists, arson, insurance fraud, 25-year-old murders, and the possibility of an animal-loving victim who literally went to the dogs. So as mentioned, Helen would disappear in 1977, and her body has never been found. Although in 1984 she would officially be declared dead. However, indictments and trials stirred up by revelations unearthed in the investigation are still being filed. Though one man is in prison for life for soliciting her murderer, authorities are unfortunately no closer to actually answering the question, what happened to Helen Brock? Police, private investigators, journalists, you name it, have all weighed in with different theories as to what happened to her. There is no shortage of suspects with motives that all center around the same thing: greed. At the time of Helen Brock's disappearance, she was worth more than $20 million. And that much money can make murder look like a very sweet deal to the wrong person. So it's pretty commonly agreed upon, I would say, that greed clearly had a place in this case. It was no secret that Helen had a lot of money, being the heiress to the candy empire. And it sounded like many of the people in her circle wanted this kind of money. Helen was described as generous to a fault. And some people would say that she even cared more for animals than people. Helen's goal in life was to indulge her lifelong dream of owning horses. And tragically, what she would get was much more sinister. Because of the twists and turns of this case and so many different theories to explore, it seems like people will be talking about the disappearance of Helen Brock for a very long time. However, as time goes on, and with her tragic disappearance nowhere close to being solved, many people do think that this will remain a classic unsolved crime. So let's talk a little bit about Helen. She was not born into the world of the super rich and affluent, which may come as a surprise to you because it definitely did to me. I just assumed she was born into wealth, but she actually lived most of her life in very humble circumstances. And it wasn't until she was almost 40 years old that she would meet the man who would take her from the humble life she came from and introduce her into the world of exceptional luxury. A man by the name of Frank Brock was the son of the founder of the Brock candy empire. Emil J. Brock may have discovered the secret to making the best caramel out there, but it was actually his son Frank who turned the candy stand into the empire that it became. Under Frank's leadership, Emil Brock and Sons became one of the world's largest candy producers and made the family wealthy amass a fortune of $20 million, but Frank managed to do so. Frank would meet Helen, who had the maiden name of Voorhees at the time, around the time that his previous marriage was on the rocks and falling apart. Helen was the coat check girl at the Palm Beach Country Club, where Frank would spend a lot of his winters. And it was during this time that they became very close. Very quickly after, Frank ended up divorcing his current wife. He would propose to Helen and they were wed. Helen would pretty much, for the most part, transition into this new lifestyle with ease. And she did manage to retain some of her Midwestern roots. She remained very close with her family in Ohio and built comfortable homes for her parents and brother, which is very nice. Throughout the rest of her life, Helen would continue to give gifts to her family, and while she was accustomed to many of the better things in life, she actually would often fret and fuss over seemingly insignificant costs, and my guess is that's because of the upbringing she had. She wasn't used to, the lavish and rich lifestyle. So during the warmer months of the year, Frank and Helen would live on the north side of Chicago and then travel to Florida in the winter. They did not own a home in Palm Beach, but would rent a home from some longtime friends in the area. Now, 20 years after Frank and Helen get married, when they got married around 1950, Frank would end up dying in the year 1970. And at this time he was 79 years old and Helen was 58. They did not have any children while they were alive, and at this point in time, Frank had retired from the candy business, and it was really Helen that was involved. And so with no children involved, it really was just Helen left over. So she was left with a lot of money in her pocket. Helen was very private, but not reclusive. As she grew older, she became more interested in animal welfare causes and her own personal pets, and it was described in what I've read as potentially obsessive. The story circulates about how Helen once chartered a plane to bring a sick pet back from the Bahamas to be cared for by her favorite veterinarian. Her two favorite pets, by the name of Candy and Sugar, were buried in a $500,000 pink marble mausoleum she had built in her hometown in Ohio. Frank was also buried there as well, and it was also her intention that it was her final resting place. So it's not that she had just done this for the pets, Candy and Sugar. This was meant to be a family affair. She was also described as philanthropic, especially with animal causes, giving quite a bit of money to the Chicago Zoo, which named its primate house in her honor, which I think is very, very sweet. Some people would describe Helen as eccentric, and it's said that she did have a few quirks. Interestingly enough, despite being such an animal lover and being very concerned for animal rights, she was known to wear a lot of animal fur coats. She was also a compulsive journal writer who had diaries dating back decades. She would write in them every single day. In addition to this journaling, Helen was also very interested in the spirit world and practiced what's called automatic writing or spirit writing, in which the writer enters a trance-like state and his or her hand is guided to write words and phrases allegedly being communicated through spiritual forces. So, those were some of the things that she did. Helen never really had much use for the rich and lavish lifestyle that came within this society of people in Chicago, and really preferred her old friends of Ohio. She would spend a lot of time each day on the telephone with different friends back from Ohio, chit-chatting about life and, inconsequential things. But one of the people that she would call every single day was her medium, with whom she would share the results of her automatic writing or spirit writing. So on one day in February of 1977, Helen would go to the world-renowned Mayo Clinic for an appointment for herself. And she would be staying in a nearby hotel in Rochester, Minnesota. And there was a tunnel between a nearby hotel that she was staying in and the Mayo Clinic, and this was the last place anybody will or did admit to seeing Helen Brock. She had just finished a brief and uneventful checkup at the clinic where doctors said that she was fit and healthy and doing well. She would pay her bill at the clinic and was walking back to the hotel to catch a flight from Rochester back to Chicago when she ends up stopping at a gift shop to buy a snack. And it would turn out that investigators down the line would interview the person that she buys the snack from, kind of trying to understand the state that she was in at the time. And her last words to the sales clerk are still the subject of much confusion. She would say, quote, "I am in a hurry. My houseman is waiting," end quote. The clerk would swear up and down that Helen used the specific word houseman and the present tense, although no one was seen with Helen, and it was believed that she traveled to Rochester alone. Now, the houseman that she may have been referring to, and is the only person who fits the bill according to research, was a man by the name of Jack Matlick, a long-time major domo for Frank and Helen Brock, who would be on their service to essentially run the household for Helen after Frank's death. Jack Matlick was married and did not live at the Brock's estate when she was staying there. So there's little evidence that their relationship was anything more than employer to employee. Jack Matlick was vital to running that house, and Helen really did rely on him extensively. But as far as research goes, there's really not much insinuating that they had an intimate relationship. Regardless, Jack Matlick would later tell authorities investigating Helen's disappearance that he did not accompany her to Rochester, but did meet her plane in Chicago. The flight crew that flew the plane from Rochester to Chicago had no recollection of anyone fitting Helen's appearance on the flight that day. Now, if Jack Matlick is to be believed, and there have been many people along the way who actually do not trust his story, but let's just, for the sake of saying that he's going to be believed, he would have then picked up Helen from the Chicago O'Hare International Airport and brought her back to her home in Glenview. He would say that she was irritated when he arrived because he was driving a Jeep and not her pink Lincoln Continental. He had been out running errands and apparently did not have time to change cars, according to Jack's story. Okay, so let's go for our hidden gem real quick. I'm gonna go with the fact that she had a pink Lincoln Continental back in the 70s. I cannot get over how much I love the fact that she had a pink vehicle. I don't know why, it fits the whole Candy Harris Empire vibe to me. So, hidden gem is she had a pink Lincoln Continental. So comment that down below. As I mentioned earlier, Jack did not live in or at the Brock's estate, typically, and only stayed at the estate when Helen was not home. But for some reason, he had contacted his wife and told her that he was staying in Glenview at the estate that particular weekend. And his reasoning for that was that he had some work that he needed to do. Jack would later tell authorities that Helen stayed in that weekend in order to prepare for her upcoming trip to Florida. But apparently some friends who had dropped by to say hello to Helen during that time frame was told by Jack that she was not available. Now, this story that Jack tells police kind of strains the imagination. She arrived home on Thursday evening and left for Florida on Monday morning. During that time, Helen, who enjoyed talking to friends on the phone, never picked up the phone to call a friend or anything like that. So some pieces don't add up. On that Monday morning, Jack would say that he drove Helen to the airport without any luggage and without a flight reservation. Helen typically was known to travel with trunk loads of clothing and was meticulous about planning her itinerary. So, for her to go to the airport without a flight scheduled and without luggage doesn't make sense, and for the most part, that doesn't make sense for anybody. Also, she was not an early riser and frequently was known to run late for events, and historically would not schedule herself early morning flights. But on this morning, she apparently was at the airport before 7 a.m., which was 3 hours before the first plane to Florida. Over that weekend, Jack would tell investigators that Helen had signed a number of checks, including several made out to him or benefiting him in some way. These checks would to more than $15,000. Now, later on, these signatures on the checks were later determined to be forgeries. And when this kind of comes about, Jack would tell police that Helen had injured her hand while packing and had been forced to sign with her left hand. Okay, so it's a little bit sketchy. I will say in his defense, based off research that I read, handwriting experts did look at the signatures and determined that they were not signed by Jack himself. However, the handwriting was never tested against any other samples, so kind of inconclusive if you ask me. So, at some point in the journey, Jack becomes estranged with his wife, and she would later say that Jack had called her on Thursday, February 17th of 1977, to tell her that Helen had not returned from the Mayo Clinic and that he was going to stay at the estate to wait for her. Now, during that same weekend, Jack purchased a small attachment for a blender, and it was a meat grinder specifically. So this could be something very casual that he needed, but it also could be very sketchy. Jack would also make arrangements to have carpeting replaced in one of the rooms of the house at the Brock estate and to have the room repainted. Now, of course, well, not of course, but in this case, I think it's pretty smart to do. Police would contact these contractors who carried out the work, and they would testify that nothing was out of the ordinary in the room. That meat grinder attachment, which led to speculation that Helen had been murdered and ground up, and even one of the more off-the-wall theories is that she was fed to her pets, was later found to be much too small to accomplish such a grisly task. Jack would wait 2 weeks from the date that he said he dropped Helen off for her trip to Florida before he would report her missing. He would go to the Glenview Police Department to file a missing persons report, only to be told that a missing persons report needed to come from a family member. And so Jack would contact Helen's only living relative, which was her brother, Charles Voorhees. And when he kind of gets this news that his sister is gone missing, he immediately flies from Ohio to Chicago to file this report. Now, before he would actually go to the police station to ask the authorities to search for Helen, Charles would actually make a pit stop at the Brock estate with Jack to take a deeper look at things. Charles would follow Jack's lead when they searched the house for clues and would agree that they should follow Helen's wishes and destroy her journals and automatic writings. Now, the reason they knew this is because she had left explicit instructions to burn the journals and papers, quote, if something should happen, end quote. At this point, she had been gone 2 weeks, but nobody had really any evidence to indicate that anything had happened to her, other than a significant deviation in her normal routine. But nonetheless, they proceeded with burning these documents and journals, which I find odd because nothing indicated that something bad had happened to her. Also, these documents evidence could very well have provided important clues for the people who wanted to actually find her. So, this is also sketchy to me that they would immediately proceed with burning these notes and journals. So, whatever evidence they might have or insight deeper into things that Helen was experiencing about that maybe she wasn't telling people had been immediately just erased permanently and lost forever. Then after undoubtedly destroying valuable clues to his sister's whereabouts, he would then go to the police station to report her missing. Now, when the police get wind of this and actually get the formal report from Charles, they're very much puzzled by Helen's disappearance and very frustrated by the actions of Jack and Charles. And for very good reason. They immediately focused their investigation on Jack. From the police perspective, no ransom demand had been made for Helen, and Jack's claim of dropping her off at the Chicago O'Hare Airport with no luggage and no itinerary was unbelievable to them. But under pretty intense questioning and interrogation, Jack stuck to his story. He would tell police that he and Helen had exchanged some harsh words over the sale of an automobile, but beyond that, he claimed that they got along fine and that there were no issues whatsoever. He would also refuse to back down from his claim that Helen had signed the checks with an injured hand and that they were not forged checks. Eventually, Jack agrees to take a series of polygraph tests, but the results ended up being inconclusive. Jack told police that he had nothing to do with Helen's disappearance and that he would not benefit from her death in any way. And he would also mention to them that he was not listed in her will, so he would not become the beneficiary to all of her fortune. Jack would also later claim that he showed a copy of Helen's will to the Glenview police to prove that he had nothing financially to gain by killing her. But the Glenview police would deny repeatedly that Jack had actually ever shown them a copy of the will. During the investigation process, the Glenview police would search the estate several times, went over the grounds with a fine-tooth comb, and interviewed anyone with any knowledge of Helen, but would grow increasingly frustrated because with no body, no real evidence of a crime, no witnesses of a crime, and no suspects, the police's hands were really much tied at this point. Over time, leads would dry up and the clues would wither. And just to be pretty frank, eventually the Glenview police would just simply give up. There was really nothing else that they could do. But don't forget that $20 million essentially was left sitting in a bank account. And it really couldn't be sitting there forever waiting for someone who may or may not ever return. Helen may have been eccentric, but she was not stingy with her money, and those who had enjoyed her generosity over the years were not about to let things change simply because Helen wasn't around to sign the checks. So, over the years, many family members and friends benefited from Helen's generosity. There were bills to pay and expenses that had to be managed, and somebody was going to have to be in charge of all of this. The man with the strongest argument that it should be him was Everett Moore, which was Helen's personal accountant. Everett had been running Helen's day-to-day accounting needs since before Frank had died, and he was the man who was the most familiar with how she spent her money. He knew all about her credit card bills, the charity requests, tax bills, anything that she had really been spending money on. He knew about it. And so in the spring of 1977, he asked the Cook County Probate Court to appoint him administrator over Helen's estate. But there was a small problem here. Helen was a co-trustee of the Helen Brock Trust set up under Frank's will. The other trustee was Continental Illinois Bank, and the Continental Illinois Bank felt that it, specifically not Everett Moore, the accountant, should be in charge of Helen's money because it had fiduciary responsibility over the trust in her absence. And so therefore, if the trust happened to be mismanaged in Helen's absence, that they themselves as the bank would be responsible. So in layman's terms, if Everett screwed up and made bad decisions with Helen's money, and if she were to ever return, she could then turn around and sue the Continental Bank for Everett's mistakes. And understandably so, the bank did not want to be held liable for that, especially when it comes up to $20 million worth. And so this would begin an intense legal scrutiny of Helen's disappearance. So what's interesting is that it wasn't the fact that she goes missing for 2 weeks or 2 weeks plus, and Jack has this really sketchy story, but it's that $20 million that is left behind that prompts this intense search. So the judge that ends up presiding over this case would appoint the former head of the Chicago Bar Association, John Cadwallader Mink, to be guardian ad litem in the matter. He was going to be in charge of finding out as much about the disappearance of Helen as he possibly could, and just to learn about her as much as possible. But unfortunately, his investigation went nowhere. He would go on to take depositions from different people like Chad Matlick and the brother Charles Voorhees, as well as Everett Moore, just to try to gain any insight into Helen. One of the depositions he would take would be the most troubling, and that was from one of Helen's friends by the name of Richard Bailey. Richard Bailey had taken Helen to New York over New Year's Eve and had actually been the one to arrange her stay at the Mayo Clinic, which again was the place where she was last seen alive. Richard Bailey was also supposed to meet her in Florida and was reportedly in Fort Lauderdale when she disappeared. He also helped Helen purchase some racehorses within the last year before her disappearance, and Richard Bailey was known as a well-known shady character in the high-flying Chicago set. He was also described as a man of questionable ethics who more than once had been involved in the less than above-board dealings with some of the city's ruthless horse community. So interesting that Helen found herself involved with this man. Richard Bailey would show up at John Mink's office with his attorney in tow for the deposition and refused to even admit his name under questioning. Richard Bailey even had his attorney state that he would not be answering questions based on his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And because this was not a criminal investigation at this point, this was still all about the money, John Menck had no way to compel Richard Bailey, who also would not even admit that he knew Helen. So for 3 years, John Menck would act as a guardian ad litem for Helen, and over that time, he investigated or caused to be investigated every possible lead connected to her disappearance. But eventually, John was forced to go to the probate court to report that she had not been found. And at this time, the court would declare Helen Voorhees Brock officially a missing person and named Everett Moore as the overseer of her accounts. The judge ruled that in 4 years from that time, which would be 1984, the parties could return to the court and petition the court to have Helen legally declared dead. Helen's disappearance was hot gossip at the time, and people were talking about this, especially in the affluent community. And it's not every day that the heiress to an empire goes missing. And Richard Bailey would come up in this gossip. There were plenty of people around Chicago who were certain that meant Helen had been met with foul play just because she was involved with Richard. Richard was also described as a con artist who specialized in fleecing wealthy older women out of their savings through bad investments in horses. He was well connected and well versed in the business of horse trading, and Richard had an eye for both shady deals and blissfully ignorant women. His MO was to get himself introduced to a potential victim, wine and dine the woman while slowly bringing her into his world of expensive horse shows and pricey stables. He would defraud middle-aged or older women who had recently been widowed or divorced. So, in this case, it's not surprising why Helen was an easy target for him. Now, Richard's thing was that during this process, if he discovered that the woman was not wealthy, he would decline to see her again. But if she was wealthy, he proceeded to secure her affection, engaging in sex, and in some cases he would even propose marriage, despite the fact that he himself was already married. So really, he just liked to prey on women for their money. Let's go ahead and fast forward to 1984, because there were numerous men involved that essentially wanted a cut of Helen's money, and 4 years later would have her declared legally dead, which was 1984, as the judge had advised. And it was at this time that they probated her will. Her brother Charles would be the big winner, coming away with a nice amount of cash and a great deal of control over the Brock Foundation. Jack Matlick ended up actually owing the estate money when it was all said and done because of various loans and leases. And then animal protective organizations would also benefit quite nicely from Helen's financial estate because she was so big on her philanthropic efforts. Now again, still with no clues, no body, no clear motive, no suspects, literally nothing. The different law enforcement agencies that had been involved basically stood by and just watched as the benefactors divided up the estate. There was no question to them that she had been met with foul play, because there was no indication that she had chosen to just disappear one day. But nothing could be proven. Somewhat of a break in a case would come about in a very roundabout way and would take everyone that had been involved with this case by complete surprise. In 1989, the government was confronted with a number of women who had been the victims of interstate scams conducted with the aid of telephone wire fraud, and the U.S. attorney with jurisdiction in Chicago began to investigate this rampant fraud that was transpiring, and it ends up happening that the fraud is noticed within the horse business in Chicago. So as you can only imagine, it did not take long for Mr. Richard Bailey's name to come up in connection with the frauds. The prosecutor who ended up taking the case was Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephen Miller, and he was a tough Chicago lawman who was equally at home with Byzantine white-collar frauds and ruthless, cold-blooded murder cases. Stephen Miller was approached by investigators who wanted the U.S. attorney to take a look at the Richard Bailey horse fraud ring. He said, quote, I was told that Richard Bailey, who I had never heard of, was rumored to have defrauded many women over the years in transactions involving horses, and had even dated Helen Brock. And once he said that, really in a flash, the investigative plan came into being, end quote. And this was something that he ends up telling Dateline after a local investigator had asked him if he wanted to investigate this horse fraud ring. And Stephen Miller's plan was simple: follow the money, solve the murder. Now, Stephen Miller and his team had none of the usual pieces of a murder investigation, but they had a very strong circumstantial case against Richard Bailey. But in the beginning of all of this, they still had to find the single thread that they could pull in order to unravel this entire mess. And it was then that they found Dr. Ross Hughey. He was a large animal veterinarian, and he ended up playing small roles in Richard Bailey's scams, but he was in it deep enough that Stephen Miller and his team could use a little muscle to convince him to turn on the rest of the crew that he was involved with. Dr. Hughey had helped with the frauds, but he knew enough about Richard Bailey to know that he wanted no part of any case involving this man. He did not want to be sitting in a courtroom next to Richard Bailey, so he ends up helping Steve Miller. What they end up finding out is that Helen had no idea who she was dealing with when it came to Richard Bailey, and Richard Bailey was really just the front man for this fraud that he had going on. There was a whole gang of men behind him that she knew nothing about that were even worse and ruthless. They were killers. Their whole life is how they were described. One of the men that was involved in this horse ring dates back to the 1930s, when the Jane family began shipping in horses from the West, and they were known as the Jane Gang. And they ran the Chicago horse business, and this gang became an organized criminal enterprise that looked at murder as a means of doing business. The man that founded this gang was Silas Jane, and it turns out that this man, and criminals would flock to him as a mentor and as a teacher. And there's no question that Silas Jane was a cold-blooded killer. He even had his own brother killed, and so I'm giving you this context to understand the kind of people that were involved in this fraudulent horse ring that backed Richard Bailey. So Helen essentially was in close proximity to some very, very dangerous people. It would take Stephen Miller and his team 5 years, but by 1994 they had gathered enough evidence against Richard Bailey and more than 24 other defendants to take the case to a federal grand jury. And it was in July of 1994 that the U.S. attorney announced a 29-count indictment against Richard Bailey, who was charged with conspiring to murder, soliciting the murder, and causing the murder of Helen Voorhees Brock. Now, during the trial, the U.S. attorneys would get to the heart of their case and would address Richard Bailey's motive for having Helen killed. They would say that Helen found out she was being scammed and that she was going to go to the authorities. Now, Richard Bailey was not new to being in this position, but he had never been in this position with someone as powerful and as rich as Helen Brock. While some of his earlier cons could have been passed off as matters that would have gone through like civil courts, Helen wanted to go to the district attorney, and she wanted Richard Bailey to go to jail, and she told him so. And so in her confrontation of Richard Bailey, that forced him to act against her. And basically, his motive to kill her was damage control and to protect himself. So he needed to silence her. Richard Bailey's defense team was never able to provide much of a counter argument to this, to the onslaught of evidence that the prosecutors would present at trial. And it was not surprising that the decision of the judge and the jury was not going to go well for Richard Bailey. There was a quote that said, "It is more probable than not that Richard Bailey did commit the offenses of conspiring to murder and soliciting the murder of Helen Brock." The judge would sentence him to life in prison plus a fine of $1 million. 19 people were indicted at the same time as Richard Bailey as a result of this investigation into the disappearance of Helen Brock. Authorities in northern Illinois uncovered a nationwide horse killing insurance fraud scheme, which resulted in guilty pleas from 16 of the people indicting. But this was actually just the beginning. In the course of looking for Helen's murderer, authorities would solve a string of homicides from 1955 all the way through 2002. So the probe into the disappearance of Helen Brock's murder has resulted in a total of 33 convictions on a range of charges, including fraud, arson, and obstruction of justice. Helen Brock's body has never been found, but in her hometown in Ohio, resting in that pink marble mausoleum, her husband Frank and her dogs Candy and Sugar lay waiting for her to come home. Again, we don't know what happened to Helen's body. We don't know how she was murdered. If she was really murdered, technically, because the body was never found, but I think it's pretty safe to say that somebody did her brutal harm. We don't know if Richard Bailey physically saw this murder through, or if he had somebody else do it. But what we know is that in 1977, she disappeared and was never found alive or dead. That will conclude the case of the Candy Empire